Hi guys, it's Jess from Minerva and I've got a really exciting sew along for us to do together today. It is the Vicki Sews Cheryl Jacket. Now I'm really excited for this one because I've wanted to make this jacket for a while. It is a challenging sew, it's more an advanced pattern and there are some challenging elements to it, I believe, like the quilting, etc. and some techniques I've not personally done before. But we all love a challenge, don't we, when it comes to sewing? So I think this will be really a great one to make. Plus, I've always wanted a quilted jacket. I just love the shape of this one. I think it's very cool, baggy, drop shoulders, everything I love in a jacket. I think it'll be a really good autumn, well, for the UK, autumn and spring jacket rather than depths of winter, as it is a slightly thinner jacket, but I think it'll be perfect for autumn. So, grab that cup of tea or your glass of wine and let's get going, shall we? So firstly, what do we need for this project? So outside of the basics and obviously a fabric, which I'll discuss in a minute, we will need some wadding, or as the pattern calls it, some insulation. So I'll link everything below this video so that you can access it and obviously find all the products you need. But this is essentially just some insulation or wadding. You also will need some interfacing, just a small amount of it to strengthen, I believe, around the pockets. This is Finalizing soft and iron-on fusing, so you need some of that. And also we need 5 sew-on fasteners. So these are meant to be 5/8 of an inch to 3/4 of an inch sew-on snaps. So you'll need some of those as our fasteners. So when it comes to fabric, there are some quite detailed recommendations on the pattern. So it is supposed to be a light or medium weight fabric, non-stretch, and because it is a jacket, they recommend wind and water resistant. So it does get quite tricky to find relevant fabrics for this pattern, but I'll tell you a little bit more about what I did in the end. It talks about including natural fibres like cotton, or it could be artificial or blends. But they recommend the following: water-resistant outerwear fabrics, gabardine, juice bow, taslan, membrane fabrics, taffeta or PU coated polyester. So as I say, they're quite specific fabrics and not super easy to find. But the lining is a little bit easier. The lining, they recommend again, artificial or blends, things like viscose and polyester, etc. So, as I say, it's a little bit hard to find those fabrics. So I decided to not bother too much about the water resistant, and just focus on something that I could imagine working well for an autumn jacket. You don't have to wear it in the rain in the end of the day. So I think as long as it's a light medium weight fabric, that is quite important for this pattern. I think you could probably use some different ones and the recommendations there. I decided to make it really complicated for myself, and I decided to try and make a reversible one. So instead of the lining, it's an actual proper fabric that I'd want to be seen on the outside. Now, quilted jackets are quite good to do reversible because you bind these seams anyway and then you can sew them down. So I'm fairly confident it'll be okay, but just a couple of things to probably point out. So obviously that means you've got 2 pieces of proper fabric rather than just lining. I bought 2 medium weight fabrics. So might not be the best idea. Maybe if you get a light fabric still on one side and then a medium weight to balance out, so things aren't too difficult, particularly when it comes to binding the edges, etc., because you do that in the same fabric. But nevertheless, the fabrics I chose were this soft cotton duck canvas. It's a medium weight. This is actually colour is called mauve, but to me it looked kind of lilac-y. So this is quite, although it says medium weight, I would say it's almost like medium to heavy. It's not the heaviest canvas you'll get, to be fair, so I guess for a canvas it is medium weight, but it obviously has quite a lot of structure, quite kind of crispy texture. So I thought that'd be good for a jacket in the end of the day, because it's tough, it's canvas, it's made for this kind of thing. As you can tell, I've already cut my fabric out, hence the random little bit of fabric I've got here. But yeah, this is a nice lilac colour. I thought I'd do one side in lilac, and then I decided I will do one side in a bright pink. So yeah, I love pink, and I thought, why not have a really bright pink? So I did want one side to try and get a water resistant fabric. So this is one of the Minerva core range. Oh, so is this, by the way, it's Minerva core range 2. So this is Minerva core range water resistant fabric. It's really good for probably outside projects, to be honest, but it seemed fine for this jacket as well. It is medium weight, it's not super, I'm probably making loads of noise crunching this up. It's not super heavy. So it felt kind of like it'd be a good option for this project. It does have a slight shine to it, as you can see. So it does kind of almost have like a plasticky coating. So hopefully once that's finished and as it's on the coat, it will look kind of fine, because you often do get that kind of texture on many kind of water resistant coats. This is the colour Cerise. Nice bright pink there. So yeah, they're my choices, but do follow along even if you don't want to do a reversible one. I will be showing you the instructions as per the pattern, but I'll also be showing the options for if you're doing a reversible. So either way round, join me. This is going to be a fun project. It's not going to be the easiest one, but we'll do it together. So the next thing we're going to want to do is, before you buy your fabric, check your sizing so you know how much to buy. The pattern comes in 3 sizes: extra small to small, medium to large, and extra large. So you can check your sizes on the back. Because of my bust, well, actually all 3, bust, waist and hip measurements, I went for medium to large. But do remember, this is a very baggy pattern. So it might be that you decide, if you're between 2 sizes, you might decide actually to go for the smaller one in case you don't want it quite as baggy, or you go for the larger one and change it once you're kind of making it, make it a bit smaller, which might be safer. So just bear that in mind, that it is a baggy fit, so choose wisely, but there is only 3 sizes to choose from, which makes it a bit easier. So obviously before we start, you'd need to wash your fabric. I didn't wash the pink one because it's got a plastic coating on it, and I didn't know how that would go down in the sheen, but I will pre-wash the other one, the canvas. This is obviously to avoid any shrinkage in case it does shrink in the wash, because you don't want to do that afterwards. I did think, to be fair, it's very unlikely I'll be washing the coat once I've finished with this project. You're more likely to maybe get it dry cleaned. So if you do feel like you might not wash it, you might skip this stage, but to be honest, even with dry cleaning, I'd just pre-wash your fabric. It's probably just safer. Let's all just pre-wash our fabric. Great, so obviously once we've done that, we've got our fabric ready. We might need to iron it again, obviously, after it comes out the wash. We need to cut out our pattern. Now, as I said, there's only 3 sizes, so that makes it quite easy, but there are 2 markings per size. Now, this is because in the pattern, after we've quilted, we will put the pattern back on the pieces and cut it smaller. I don't 100% understand why. I think it's something to do with quilting. Please do tell me in the comments. I think just to get really like sharp edges after quilting it, but that does mean when you're cutting out the pattern originally, you'll want to cut it the larger line. So it has obviously the 3 sizes, so choose your size and there'll be 2 lines. Just do the bigger one to start with, and then the pattern will tell you when we will cut it smaller to that second line. So that confused me at first. I thought I'd note that out. Right, so we're prepared. We've got all our stuff ready. We've got our pattern cut out. Now it's our least favourite bit, my least favourite bit, cutting out the fabric. So once you've done that, come back and join me and we're ready to start. But first, a quick little note for when you're cutting out your fabric. Make sure you remember to mark on your snap markings. So I just made a little snip in the little cross shape and then drew through the snips with a water dissolvable pen to mark those on my fabric. You'll also see that there are quilting lines on the pattern as well. So when you still have the pattern pinned on, mark these lines just at the edge. Try and do them in the direction that the lines are going, because that will really help you in a kind of diagonal manner. You'll also need to mark on your pocket markings as well, which can be a little bit difficult. So I'd recommend some carbon fabric kind of marking paper for this, so you can lay it underneath the pattern and then draw over the top so that it marks it on the fabric. So once you've cut out your fabric, we need to mark on the quilting lines. You only need to do this on the front of your fabric and not your lining. I did this by laying the pattern on top so I could roughly see where they were and what angle they were. And then matching the markings I'd made at the edge, I used a ruler to connect them and drew them on like that. For the really long lines, I had to use 2 rulers and kind of match them and put them together so that I made sure I was drawing at the correct angle. Keep going like this in a similar way, matching all the markings, comparing with the pattern, and draw on all your quilting lines to the right side of your fabric. Before we move on to the next part, make sure you actually also interface your pocket area on the wrong side of the fabric. I actually forgot to do this, so I haven't shown you this, but my fabric was quite strong, so it actually didn't matter so much. But particularly if you've got slightly lighter fabric, do make sure you interface your pocket area. Next, lay your fabric good side down, and then lay the wadding or insulation on top. And then finally your lining, which for me, as I'm doing a reversible pattern, is the pink fabric. Obviously, if you're doing a reversible version, then this is just your other fabric, facing good side or right side up. This is one of the front panels, but you'll be doing these next stages for all 5 panels, the front 2 fronts, the back, and the 2 arm pieces. We then want to pin all 3 of these layers together. So you want to pin from the side you drew the quilting lines on, the front of the jacket. I started with the corners and then pinned in between them. We also need to pin the intersections of the quilting lines. It's good to check from time to time that you're going through all the layers, as you want to stabilise the layers together, ready to quilt them. So keep going, just pinning all the intersections and all the edges, making sure everything's lying nice and flat. Probably should give your fabric a bit more of an iron than I did as well. I think I missed that stage, but keep going until you've pinned all of the different points. When I was finished with this, I checked the other side just to make sure it looked okay and made any adjustments to parts that looked a bit bunched up or wrong in any way. Once we've done the pinning, we have to baste all of the quilting lines. Yes, all of them. So you want to get a contrasting thread for this, and we can just do long running stitches all along the lines. Now this is going to take you quite some time, it did me, particularly for all 5 panels that we have. So you might want to put this video on pause and then come back once you've finished all your basting. So welcome back. I hope that went okay and you have managed to finish all your basting okay. So for all of us that are doing the reversible version, before we move on, remember that you will need different bobbin thread to match the fabric that will be on the bottom when quilting. So change your bobbin thread, get that all set up. As I'd not done any quilting before, I also decided to do a little test with the 3 layers of fabric. And I actually found out that the normal tension on my machine made the bobbin thread come through to the top a little bit too much. So you can't really see it on that side of the pink, but on the other side of the purple fabric, you can just see kind of the pink peeping through. So I did a little fiddling, and I found that by reducing my tension down to about 2 on my machine, it gave me a much better stitch line. And if you have a look, I did a couple of different tests, but the one on the left is the one that was at a 2 tension. You see it's much less pink. However, when I actually started quilting, I found that I was still getting loads of issues with the thread length going really small and really long, and it just made it look really messy. So as a novice quilter, I turned to the sewing community and found that a quilting foot is recommended, as it keeps the top layer moving at a similar speed to the bottom as it has feed dogs on the foot itself. So this is what I'm using here, the actual quilting foot. And once I had this, I was well away. So I'd recommend a quilting foot for sure to do your quilting with, as it gives you much neater lines. The pattern recommends a 4 stitch length. So get quilting, just follow your lines, and see you back here when you've finished. So now that we've quilted all of our panels, we need to get the pattern back out. This is where the second line that I mentioned earlier comes in. So we need to cut out the pattern at that second line. So after we've done this, we can lay the pattern back on our quilted panels, matching the quilt lines as best as possible. This is the way you match the pattern back with your actual quilted panel. So I found that mine didn't match exactly, but I matched it as best as I could. So then pin the pattern down and start cutting out your panels out at this smaller size. Now that we've cut out our panels again, we're going to be sewing all around the edge in a long stitch. This just keeps all the pieces of fabric together at the edge, which makes it easier to work with at the next stages when binding, etc. So we want to do this with all 5 of our quilted panels. Once we've done the edge stitch, give the edges a little press. This again keeps them nice and flat and easier to work with later. If you didn't do it while, this is a really good stage to do a little fit check. Now, don't laugh, but mine was pretty big. Due to the stiffer fabrics I used, it stuck out like a fancy dress costume, like a raspberry or something. But although it has a baggy pattern, it is a baggy pattern and it's baggy shape, this is where I realised that I probably could have got away with cutting the smaller size. But nevertheless, by doing a quick check, I had a chance to take off some of the volume at the side seams and at the shoulder. So it's a good chance also to check and test the pocket placement. I found it just seemed a bit low on me, so I ended up taking some volume off the side seam, some off the shoulder, and also raising the pockets up slightly, as it just felt for me that they were just too low. So make any adjustments you need here, and cut any of your pattern back if you need to, any of your panels. And next we'll be moving on to the pockets. So to start the pockets, get the 2 pocket welt pieces and the welt insulation pieces. Fold the fabric in half lengthways, good sides together, and then pin the insulation to one side at either end. Then sew the insulation at either end to the fabric. The seam allowances on this pattern are in general 1 centimetre unless it states otherwise. We can then trim the wadding a little bit so that there's less bulk, and then we want to turn it right sides out. When you turn it out, you want to push out the corners a little bit, so they're nice and sharp. Next we want to pin the long edge. So I stuffed the insulation in against the folded edge as I did this to ensure that it was filled out nicely. Then sew along the edge with a 4 to 5 millimetre stitch length. I did a 1 centimetre seam allowance, but it looked less than this in the pattern, so it might be better to do it about 5 millimetres, as I could see this row of stitching on my finished pocket, and then obviously repeat this on the other pocket welt. Next, you should have marked on your pocket markings, so now we want to baste the bounding box, which is the smaller box. So just baste all the way around the edge of this smaller box. And and you should see it from the other side of your garment. After you've done that, on your lining side, place the lining pocket piece pointing inwards away from the side of the jacket. We want to match the box that you've got on your lining and the one you've done with your basting. So pin around the box. I didn't pin actually on the box because it made basting really hard, but pin around it so it's in the right place, matching those boxes perfectly, and then you can baste the pocket lining down onto the jacket. Once we've finished basting, flip back to the right side of your jacket and place your insulated welt piece meeting the central line in your bounding box. Your welt will be pointing downwards towards the centre front of the jacket. Pin that down, ensuring where possible that the edge of the pocket welt doesn't go over the edge of the bounding box, as basically it may cause it to look a bit messy when finished, like it did with mine. But then we want to baste our welt in place. If in doubt, it's best to place your pocket a little over the central line if it means your row of stitching on the welt isn't over the bounding box line underneath the welt. Mine was, and it meant that I could see the line of stitching on the finished pocket as mentioned earlier. Obviously it's not the biggest issue, but it might be worth considering. If you sewed your welt together at the 5mm like I mentioned, you probably won't have an issue, so you can use that central line as a guide. So next, take your pocket facing, which you will have marked on the wrong side with the welt bounding box. So match again the right side with the box on the right side of your jacket and pin down and baste in place. We then need to sew around this box on the machine, following the markings on your pocket facing. When doing this, we have to slightly angle the side so the long line opposite the welt or closest to the side seam is 2 to 3 millimeters shorter on both ends. This is so that when the pocket opening is cut and the welt is turned up, it fully covers the gap. I think I could have angled mine a little more than I did, to be honest. Now for the slightly scary bit, we have to cut the central line in the box to make the pocket opening. I was too worried that I was going to slip with the rotary cutter, so I just started with that and then cut the rest with scissors. You also have to cut the diagonal lines in the corners, which I found a little difficult because I think I need to sharpen my scissors. But once you've done this, you can turn the facing to the lining side and it should technically sit flat. However, mine didn't really sit flat at all, and I found that it was because the diagonal corner lines hadn't been cut enough, so I cut those closer into the corners and this worked better. Still not perfect, but better. I did end up cutting the seam allowance of that, bounding box, where we've cut that central line. I cut those down a bit smaller to reduce bulk, as I found it was easier to sit flat on the inside once I'd done this. Just another note on sewing your facing down. Be really careful to pivot exactly at the edge of the pocket. I found that on one side the facing didn't cover the edge of the pocket, although this is less of an issue because you can't see it. But on the other side, I actually overshot the pocket by a couple of millimeters, which meant my welt didn't cover the corner of the opening, which isn't great. What I should have done was ignored the corner of the markings that I'd drawn on and felt for the edge of the pocket and pivoted one stitch after. So that's my main tip for this part of the pocket. Next, we need to iron the bottom edge of the pocket facing. So fold the edge over to the wrong side of the pocket facing and iron over by 1 centimetre. Then fold down onto the pocket lining and pin as we'll be sewing this down. When sewing the facing to the pocket lining, we just want to use an edge stitch, nice and close to the edge of the facing. In the pattern, it says to basically baste everything, including this, but to be honest, I didn't bother with some of the more simple stages, so I didn't baste this personally. So this should give you a nice, neat finish on the pocket facing. So as mentioned earlier, I cut down the seam allowance on this box to help the facing sit flatter. If you haven't done it already, then you might want to do it at this stage, as I did on this one, as the top and the sides are the hardest parts to get to sit flat. So we then want to turn up the top edge of the pocket facing and pin to the lining. Again, you're supposed to baste this, but I just sewed it down with the pins in. I assumed 1 centimetre, as this is what the pattern states, the seam allowance is, and it doesn't say otherwise, but from the pictures in the pattern, it did look like they used a much smaller seam allowance. This happened a few times throughout where I felt like the seam allowance they were using was smaller, but I just stuck to 1 centimetre as the pattern actually states. So pause the video here while you repeat these stages on the other pocket of your other front piece of your jacket, and we'll see you for the next section. Next, we want to prepare the other pocket lining piece. Hopefully you've drawn the line across the middle that was on the pattern, but if not, draw it on now. And then you need to get the other pocket facing and place it on your pocket lining, right sides together. The seam allowance line on the pocket facing, which isn't drawn on, but will be essentially 1 centimetre from the edge, needs to be placed on the line on your pocket lining, matching those lines. Once you've done that, pin and sew it on. Turn the pocket facing up so it sits matching the top part of your pocket lining. Then press the seam with the facing in this position. Once it's nice and pressed and flat, we will then need to stitch an edge stitch along this pressed edge. Place this pocket lining piece on top of your other one. The pattern says wrong sides together, but to me it more seems like wrong side to right side of the pocket piece already attached. Pin these pieces together. I had to make a few adjustments and pull the one already attached quite a lot so that they matched, as it was all caught up in, you know, the being pulled through to the other side. I don't know, but it was a bit difficult, but if you readjust it, you should be able to get them to match and pin them together. Once you've done this, you can baste them together in place. We then want to sew all the way around. I just did it again, a 1 centimetre seam allowance. As you can see, I didn't baste mine, but it might have been a good idea, and I would recommend basting for this stage. As you can see, it was hard just by pinning to keep all the 4 layers of fabric together, particularly as my fabric was starting to fray, which meant I didn't catch all the layers in my stitch, which gave me a pretty messy finish and caused me some issues later on. Now I'm going to be honest, from this point on the instructions in the pattern didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I went over and over it a million times and even emailed Vicki Sews, but I think there's either something missing from the English pattern or the pictures are maybe slightly misleading. So I'll show you the best way I worked out how to do this next part that sticks as close to the pattern as possible. I would watch this part before you start on it yourself, as you might find there's a slightly easier way to do it rather than having to stick to the pattern instructions like I did, or try to. So firstly, from the front side of the jacket, you need to bring the top edge of the top pocket lining piece through to the front. I just brought the whole pocket bag out to the front as it didn't really seem to make a difference and was clearer to see and to explain to you. I tried this part loads of different ways, pulling out in different manners, but it didn't seem to make any other sense other than this way, as otherwise you would just be sewing the pattern closed. We then want to match the 2 pocket facing top edges and pin and then baste them together. We then can make a line of stitching to join them together 5mm away from the edge. Then we're told to cut the seam allowance, but we don't actually have a seam allowance when it's turned to the front of the jacket. So this is when it didn't really make much sense to me. So I brought it back to the lining side so that I could cut the seam allowance as directed to 3mm. The pattern then shows to press the nice flat seam on the lining side, but if you follow the pattern so far, you won't have this, you'll have the raw stitched edge like I do. So I decided to sew around the edge again from the front side of the jacket, essentially doing a French seam, so that on the inside of the jacket we'll have the nice enclosed seam like we're supposed to. If you're not trying to follow the pattern perfectly like I was, you could have done this at the same time as sewing the top edge together, as long as you cut the seam allowance already. So press that pocket piece edges and then sew around the edge at around 5mm. From now, everything will match the pattern again, so that's good, and we can press our pocket bag on the lining side of the jacket so the edges are nice and flat. The next stage on the pattern is to sew all the way around the edge of the pocket from the lining side or inside of the jacket. So I started from the top corner and essentially kind of folded the jacket back on itself to get it out of the way so you can see the edge better to sew. You might want to change your foot for this, but as there wasn't a lot of room at the sides, but I found it fine sewing with the normal foot. The pattern says to stitch 5mm from the edge at this stage, but if you had to do the previous stage the same as me, you may have to do a little more than 5mm to ensure you encapsulate the seam on the other side, as we're essentially doing another French seam. So you don't want to have the edge sticking out on the other side. So keep sewing all the way around. And just a side note on this stage, I tend to forget about changing my needles for different fabrics or if it's blunted through a project. And I caught loads of little nicks in my lining sewing this. So please learn from my mistakes and think about changing your needle. We've done loads of hardy work up until now and it may have got a bit blunt like mine did. I did actually change it after this. So continue working all the way around the edge and back along the top to meet where you started. So there we go, the inside of the pocket's pretty much done. You may be able to see on my edges in the top corner it looks a little bit messy, and just to note that's due to the issue I mentioned earlier, not catching all 4 pieces of fabric together, which made it difficult to capture them in the French seam, so it's definitely worth basting at that stage as I mentioned earlier. Next, around the pocket opening we want to sew right in the seam line, or basically stitching in the ditch. This is essentially to neaten things up from the inside of the pocket, as you don't want a random extra space at the top and the edges. So this will mean the edges will be flush with the edges of the pocket from the outside. I'm not sure that makes any sense, as it's a really hard one to explain, but hopefully you'll see what I mean. So pin the pocket edges together like this, right in the seam line. This is one of the few stages in the pattern that it doesn't actually say to baste, which is great, so I didn't. So once you've pinned those together, go straight on to sewing. And you want to be careful to really take it slow and stitch right in the stitch line and be nice and careful on this stage. We're only doing a couple of centimetres along the side, all the way along the top, and then down again to the other side again by just a couple of centimetres. So essentially around that original bounding box that we had drawn on the pattern and on our fabric. So once you've done this, the pocket will have been sewn to the edges of the pocket opening or bounding box on the right side of the garment. As I tried to explain earlier, it's really hard. So this top edge and sides wouldn't look so nice and neat without doing this. And now we almost finished the pocket, so we just need to secure the welt. So turn it up to cover the pocket opening and baste the welt at the sides, covering the opening. If you had any issues like mine with a little bit of a hole, you might need to be a little bit creative trying to pull the welt over those holes. So now we just need to sew that on the machine. It's a edge stitch, essentially 2 millimeters away from the edge. And make sure your pocket on the underside, inside of your jacket on the bottom is laying all nice and flat as well before you do this, so you don't catch anything. That's always super annoying when that happens. And that's it for the pockets. That is all done. So repeat obviously on the other side and moving on to the next thing. Okay, so now we're ready to start assembling the jacket. Now, just to confuse you, my pink side is now acting as the front or the right side of the jacket because I want my binding to be in the purple. So now we need to lay our back piece right side up and lay your front pieces on top, the right sides together. Now pin them together at the shoulders and we want to baste them together and then sew on the machine at 1 centimetre seam allowance. I, again, didn't baste this personally as it was quite a simple, seam to sew, but you can baste it if you'd like. Once it's sewn, press the seam nice and flat so that it's flat for when we add the binding on. Okay, so once we've done the shoulder seams, we need to make the binding. So take the strips you will have cut out and iron them in half lengthways. Then iron the edge into the middle on one side only. And then do this with all of the binding pieces you've cut. Firstly, for the binding, cut a piece to the shoulder seam length. And then from the back of the jacket, start pinning the flat non-ironed half of the binding to the jacket, right sides together, matching the edges of the jacket and the binding. Then we'll want to baste the binding to the jacket so we can stabilise it in place. And this I did bother with as it is a little bit more of a tricky area to sew. Then sew it to the jacket at the normal 1 centimetre seam allowance. You can undershoot this a little bit if in doubt, as you don't want to go wider than the actual shoulder seam. We next want to fold the binding over the seam, but when trying to do this I found it a bit difficult, so I decided to trim the seam allowance down a little bit. This isn't actually in the pattern to do this, but it did help me a lot, so I'd recommend it if you're having similar issues. You can also remove your basting at the same time. This will then be easier for you to fold over the binding over the seam and pin the folded edge of the binding down. Now we want to pin and baste the binding so that the folded edge of the binding just goes over where the seam is on the other side, as we'll essentially be stitching in the ditch and catching the edge of the folded edge. I do really recommend basting this part, but if you are going to keep the pins in, then just a note, I put them in the wrong side on this piece of this video. They'll need to be in the side that you'll be sewing, on the seam side. It didn't really matter too much for me as I was going to remove them anyway after basting. So baste the binding down, again really concentrating it on the edge of the folded side being just over the seam on the other side. So now we're going to be stitching in the ditch as mentioned. So from the side already with the seam, you can take it nice and slow to make sure you're catching your edge on the other side. You can see here, you don't see the line too much from this side. And on the other side, it's fairly close to the edge, which is what we want. Now, if you're doing the reversible version like me, we'll want to sew the bound seam down to make it essentially a flat felled seam. So just pin it down, and I pinned mine towards the back of the garment. Now, before you sew it down, just a little reminder that we will want to change our bobbin thread because you want to have the other side of your fabric colour on the bottom. So then sew it down. I mean, if you chose slightly thicker fabrics like me, this will be a little bit difficult, but my machine coped with it fine. So now we want to sew the arms in. So lay your front and back pieces flat, so we have them kind of good side down, and then you'll have the armhole in front of you, and then lay the arm between them. I realised afterwards that I didn't pay much attention to which was the front and back part of the arm piece, so check this and use the correct panel for the correct side. Now start pinning the right sides together, starting at the corners and starting at the shoulder seam and then the corners, and then pinning in between these points. Then baste. I didn't tend to baste any normal simple sewing parts like the regular seams, but it doesn't make a difference, or it doesn't harm if you decide to do that. Now as you sew this arm in, you'll need to readjust the jacket a little bit to make sure you're sewing into the curve without catching or nipping any of the other panel underneath, which can be easily done. If you've sewn arms in before, this was quite a straightforward one, to be honest. Apart from the volume of the jacket, that's quite difficult. You'll probably need a big table to sew this on because you end up with a lot of fabric. Now we want to bind the arm seam. So in the same way as we did of the shoulder, we're going to pin and baste the flat edge of the binding to the body side of the seam, matching the edges and obviously right sides together. Then you can baste your binding in place and then sew the binding to the jacket at about a 1 centimetre seam allowance again. As it's curved, we just again want to be careful of the shape and readjust the garment to ensure you don't catch anything underneath. But again, this was quite simple. So keep going all the way around the armhole until you get to the other end. Like the shoulder seam binding, I trimmed the seam allowance down, folded the binding over the seam and pinned the folded edge so it covers the seam on the other side like we did for the shoulder. For those doing the reversible version, we can actually make it a little easier on ourselves than we did last time and sew from the folded edge side. As when we fold the bound seam backwards, the other side will be hidden anyway. This makes it a little neater too, as we can have more control sewing from the folded edge side of the binding. Also means my pins are actually on the correct side this time, but if you're doing reversible, then you can do it like that and continue with these binding stages as we did before, sewing the binding on, and if you're doing the reversible version, then fold back and sew the seam down like we did before. Okay, so we're really getting there now, onto the side seams. So place your jacket front and back side seams together, right sides together, and start pinning together, making sure you match the underarm seam. Again, you can obviously baste this if you want, or you can just move straight onto sewing like I did once you've pinned that all together. Once you've sewn that all the way up the side seam and all the way up the underarm, press the seam nice and flat and then it's onto the binding. So again, pin the flat edge of the binding to the back of the jacket, right sides together, matching the edges, and baste in place. And then sew the binding onto the jacket just under 1 centimetre seam allowance. Trim the seam allowance down to reduce bulk. Fold over the binding over the seam, pin and baste, and then sew in the ditch if making the regular version, or sew along the folded edge for the reversible version. Finally, for the reversible version, fold down the bound seam, pin and edge stitch it down. This will be really hard around the underarm seam cross section, and I actually couldn't do it the whole way. So I have a small part under the arm where it isn't sewn down flat. This wasn't a big issue for me and I was happy to leave it as it was, but just a word if you do have thicker fabrics like myself. Okay, so now we are ready to get the edge bindings ready. So take the arm binding pieces and fold them in half, right sides together, and then pin and sew them down. Next, for the jacket edge binding, you'll need to attach a few pieces together to make one really long strip. So place the pieces together at this diagonal, right sides together. Place them with about 1 centimetre crossover, a little bit like this. Then if you sew from the kind of right angle section to the other right angle, they will lay perfectly once pressed. Now that we've sewn our binding pieces together, give the seams a little press. And then fold the sleeve binding in half lengthways and press again. Similarly for the edge binding, press open all the seams. And then fold the binding lengthways and press in half. This fabric actually isn't meant to be ironed at all, so I did mine on a fairly low heat with a pressing cloth, but you might be able to use a roller instead. Now before we attach the binding around the front of the jacket, we need to measure the total length going around the whole jacket, up the front piece, around the neck, at the back, down the other front piece and all the way along the bottom. Once you have that measurement, add 2 centimeters and cut your binding to that length. Take the 2 ends and open the binding up, put right sides together and sew them together. I should have probably done this at a diagonal, but I just did it in normal straight stitch. Next, start pinning the folded binding all the way around. I spent some time to work out where I prefer the seams in the binding to be placed before I started pinning, so you might want to do that as well. We're just pinning the raw edge to the jacket. Once it's all pinned, it's probably worth basting, as I found my binding was kind of stretching a little as I sewed, so I had to stretch the jacket as much as possible to make sure that I didn't end up with excess binding at the end. But once you've done that, sew it on the jacket as normal with a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Be careful at the corners to manipulate the fabric as you sew to avoid nipping the fabric and sewing any little folds into it, but sew all the way around until you get to where you started. Now, like we did with the other binding, I found it best to trim the seam allowance to help it folding over the edge, but this again isn't in the pattern. Now we want to fold the binding over the edge and pin in the seam, similarly to how we did with the seam bindings. We're going to ensure that we catch the very edge of the folded side of the binding on the inside of the jacket, and then we want to baste it down. I did do this basting, and I'm glad I did, as it definitely helped me catch the edge and keep it neat as possible on the other side. It's really worth taking your time and doing this well, as I found it easy to miss the edge at times when sewing it down, even with the basting. So make sure you can't see your stitch line on the inside, as that means the folded edge isn't low enough and it won't be stitched down when you stitch in the ditch. For those doing the reversible version, it's worth mentioning that unless you think of a different way, the edge binding you choose will have to show on both sides. This is why I flipped the pink to be the right side, as I felt the pink trim would look better on the purple side than the purple trim on the pink side. You can also do the seam bindings in the opposite colour as well if you wanted, which could look quite cool. Now when stitching in the ditch to sew the binding down, take your time. Now this clip is real speed. I took it really slowly and checked from time to time as well that I was catching the edge of the binding on the other side. So it's worth taking your time and doing this nice and slow so that you do a good job. You might want to pull apart kind of the main jacket and the binding as well to kind of help you really get in that seam and sew in that seam and make sure that you're catching the edge on the other side. Next, we need to attach the sleeve hem bindings in a similar way. So pin the binding to the sleeve, matching the edges and the seams as well. And then of course, after you've pinned, you can baste if you wish also. And then sew it on as normal, a 1 centimeter seam allowance. Turn the sleeve round and fold over the binding and pin it again, the folded edge into the seam, making sure you catch the folded edge of the binding. I struggled to avoid getting my head in the way of this part, so sorry about that, because I was trying to get nice and close so I could see. But spend some time obviously making sure we're pinning right in that seam. Then again, we want to baste the binding down and sew in the seam in the same way we did for the edge binding. So repeat the steps we did previously. Lastly, all we need to do now is sew the snaps on. So I sewed these on by hand, making sure I only went through the top layer of the fabric to avoid stitches on the other side. Now this is particularly important if you're doing the reversible one, as you don't want to see a different coloured stitch on the other side. So this was fairly easy. I just sewed them all on in the markings that we would have marked on from the pattern. And now the really last thing for those doing the reversible version is you'll obviously need to do something about the fact that your pockets are going to show from the other side. So I created some patch pockets to place over the top of those pocket bags. Now to do this, I simply measured the area that was taken up with the pocket bag and drew a simple square shape with slightly rounded corners. I cut the fabric, folded over the edge and pressed it down. I know this fabric doesn't fray easily, but obviously if it did, your one did, then you might want to overlock the edges or something like that first. But once those edges were pressed, I pinned the pocket on and then I just hand sewed it. Again, making sure that I just went through the top layer of the fabric and not all the way through the jacket. And here it is, my finished jacket in all her glory. So yeah, I think it's maybe a little bit baggier than I probably would have liked. Maybe I should have done the smaller size, but it's not too bad as the baggy shape anyway. So all in all, I love the fact it's reversible and the colours and everything. So yeah, really happy with how this turned out. Great, so we did it guys, we finished our Cheryl jacket. That was quite a project, hey, but it feels so good for it to be over and I can't wait to wear it in the real world. How about you? If you did follow me along on this sew along, then firstly, thank you for joining me. And secondly, please do make sure you post your photos of your make and tag in the pattern or any fabric you used, because then it will appear against that product and we can all see it. And then we can all learn from each other, see it in different fabrics, see it in, you know, in different body shapes, and it's a real inspiration for us all. So please do share those. And if you want to see more photos of things I've made, please do feel free to follow me. My name on Minerva is Jess Makes. So until next time guys, happy sewing and have a great day.